This is module 5.4.2, fungal ecological roles. This list here is just an overview. We're going to, in fact, discuss each of these in turn. So we reveal them here. Fungi may serve as decomposers, as parasites or pathogens causing disease. They can be as mutualists, and in a couple of forms. Here we're going to list several of them. They can be mycorrhiza, we discussed at the beginning of the lecture. They can be lichens, and we'll find out about that association. And they also may serve as predators, although this is a fairly uncommon role. Decomposers is one of the key roles that fungi play. They, together with the heterotrophic bacteria, are critical in biogeochemical cycles in ecosystems, making the chemical building blocks of matter available again. For example, in the carbon cycle, in the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, these various cycles. If not for the actions of these decomposers, the fungi and the heterotrophic bacteria, we would literally be up to our elbows in dead organisms, and ecosystems would greatly slow down their productivity because of the need for the recycling of the ecological building blocks. Fungi have a very unique ability. They are some of the fungi are able to decompose wood. These are called the wood decay fungi, and they are able to digest lignin. Now, wood is actually made of cellulose fibers with a resin or glue-like substance called lignin. And to get to the cellulose, you have to be able to break down the lignin, and that's one of the things that the wood decay fungi can do. Now, the thing about decomposers is they don't know the difference between a log in the forest or a railroad tie. Of course, railroad ties support railroad tracks, and if you take away the tie, the track won't support the weight of a train. And there's one species of fungus that's known as the train wrecker. And so often, the role of decomposers can conflict with human interests. I know personally I had a picnic table. Every time it rained, mushrooms would grow out the end of it. Pretty soon you couldn't sit on it because it was crumbling away, because the enzymes of the fungal hyphae were literally eating away the table, making it weaker and weaker. There's some photographs down here. Wood decay fungi on a log in the forest, that's good. Molds or fungi growing on a house, that's bad. It's very bad, and that ceiling is nasty bad. I would not want to go in there. They obviously have to have some kind of leak. Okay, a second role beyond decomposers that fungi fill in an ecological sense is that of pathogen or parasite. And fungi can attack insects, they can attack trees, herbaceous plants, even your body. I would imagine that many of the students that are listening to this lecture have some sort of fungal infection. Maybe athlete's foot is quite common, and it can be quite benign. Of course, we put our feet into moist shoes that are warm and dark, a perfect place for fungi to grow. In addition, another fungus that attacks humans is ringworm. I can remember when I was a kid, I got ringworm several times from handling stray cats, and we were always bringing home all sorts of animals. Now, a much more serious fungal pathogen is the one that causes valley fever, also known as coccidiomycosis. Oh boy, that was terrible. In any case, valley fever is a very common fungal infection of the arid West. It occurs in low arid areas all over the West, in California and Arizona, other places as well. And we breathe in fungal inoculum, which is a fancy way of saying either fungal spores or fungal mycelium. And of course, our lungs are warm, moist places as well. And typical infection creates flu-like symptoms, or cold-like symptoms, I should say. And that's what most people get. But a few people, something on the order, I want to say 10%, get much more serious and sometimes even life-threatening symptoms. My first teaching job was when an instructor at Modesto Junior College was stricken with a very serious valley fever infection. It got in his brain. It was systemic. It was all over his body. It was a very difficult time. But he pulled through. But I think he retired shortly after that sickness. In addition to fungal parasites that attack humans, there are another way that fungi impact us is by being pathogens on our agricultural plants and animals. There are over 5,000 fungal species that attack economically valuable plants. This creates a huge loss of agricultural harvests. And so it can be very, very significant. Many plant diseases have names such as wilts or rots. I can remember as a kid growing up in California, there was a fungal disease called brown rot, and you didn't want to get that in your peaches and your plums, for example. Another role that fungi can fill in an ecological sense is as mutualists, and we're going to share with you two different ways that they can be mutualists. One is in the association called mycorrhiza. Recall that myco means fungus and rhiza means root. It's a mutualism between fungus and plant roots. And in this association, remember, mutualism is a win-win. The fungus gets food from the plant photosynthesizing, produces sugar, and will share it with the fungus. And the plant gets increased absorption because the fungus will put out lots of tiny little hyphae. And this will absorb not only water, but especially plant nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, which often limit the growth of plants. The picture you see in the upper right on this screen is the root of a pine tree. And you can see that some of the roots are regular roots, but these little short ones that are kind of light colored and look kind of forked, or they actually use the term bifurcated. These little bifurcated roots are actually special roots that the plant produces, and the fungus covers them with what they call a fungal mantle, and that's why they look white. And they'll put out these hyphal extensions from there that create a lot of surface area. All those hyphae were mostly broken when this root was collected, when you dig it up out of the soil. There are two types of mycorrhiza. Ectomycorrhiza, that is mostly on woody plants and doesn't penetrate the roots. Ecto means outside. And endomycorrhiza, that's more common. It's found on non-woody plants or herbaceous plants, herbs and grasses and such. And over 90% of plant families have an association with the mycorrhizal fungi, and it is believed by many that the fungi were in the water when plants were still primarily aquatic, and the fungi colonized land with the plants. At least that's the belief of some. Now here's a little rhyme, I suppose. Herbaceous plants need mycorrhiza to thrive. Woody plants need mycorrhiza to survive. And we can probably illustrate this best with the story of when people wanted to introduce to Australia, New Zealand, and other places that didn't have a lot of good lumber trees. They wanted to introduce pine trees. And so they took the pine seeds and they planted, and they grew the first year. They grew the second year, and they were like maybe as much as 6 inches tall, and then they died. So they kept trying it, and they couldn't. Finally, they figured out that what was missing was the mycorrhizal fungi. All they had to do was get some soil from underneath a mature tree, a mature pine tree that had mycorrhizal fungi, and they just put a little bit of soil with each seed, and inside that soil there were either spores or some mycelium, and this allowed the mycorrhizal association to grow up. And so this is a narrative that explains that. You can pause it and read it if you didn't understand my explanation. Of course, this one doesn't have nifty sound effects. This actually shows a pine plantation. This happens to be in New Zealand, not in Australia. Looks almost like a Christmas tree farm, except it's not as pretty. But the native trees of Australia, for example, are eucalyptus, and they have twisted grain, and they're not good for lumber. Here's some photos up here in the upper right. If you look, this is a comparison of two treatments that were given the same amount of water and the same soil, the same amount of light, the same temperatures. The only difference is one has mycorrhizal fungi, the other does not. And you can see that the one's not dying, but nevertheless the one that has it is thriving. So herbaceous plants need mycorrhiza to thrive. Down here in the lower panel, we can see on the right, again, seedlings of junipers, a conifer. So this is going to be a woody tree that were grown with mycorrhiza and without mycorrhiza. And the ones on the left are almost to the state where they go and die. These are not going to survive for long. And they are the same age and, again, received all the same abiotic conditions. This shows mycorrhiza. This looks very web-like here around the outside of this root. And I'm not sure the scale of this root. I think this root is pretty small. So this is a mantle of mycorrhizal fungi, of hyphae around the root. And this is quite a close-up. It's not like some big woody root like you might be thinking, but it's a smaller root. This actually shows, again, on the right, black and white, with mycorrhizal fungi without. And this is just a great photograph of a seedling that's a week or so old, and it has, look at its root development, and it'll actually show, you can see the mycorrhizal fungi, these little white buds that are forming there in the root system. Really a very cool photograph. Another example of mutualism, remember this is an interaction in which both species benefit, is lichens. Lichens are a mutualism between two different kinds of organisms, a fungus, of course, since we're studying fungi, and a green alga, which is, of course, algae. So together, these can create these interesting organisms. And there are other types of algae that are sometimes involved. But here in the upper right, we can see an alga growing, or sorry, a lichen growing on a rock. And in the upper left, we can see a lichen growing on a tree branch. And some lichens are very flat and scale-like. Some are more branched and three-dimensional. Now, lichens are part of the pioneer community in ecological succession. They arrive very early. They grow in harsh abiotic conditions, and they often change those conditions. The ones on the rock can actually secrete interesting chemicals that will help break down the rock. And so I find these growing on the fence behind my house or on the bark of the mesquite trees that are in my yard. And so this shows that we have pretty good air quality because lichens are very sensitive to air pollution. They are used as indicators of air quality. The EPA actually has a protocol in which you can sample lichens and analyze them for pollutants, and this can serve as an index of the quality of air, or an air pollution index. Of course, lichens that are in areas that are very urban with poor air quality don't survive long. For example, the Los Angeles basin has lost the majority of their lichen species. A final ecological role that fungi can fill is as predators. This is a very rare role for fungi, and some of them are nematophagous, which is a fancy way of saying they eat nematodes. And nematodes are roundworms, and here we can see a scan on the lower right, a scanning electron micrograph of a nematode worm that has been snared on both ends by these hyphal nooses of predatory fungi. After the noose closes because of water pressure, we call it hygroscopic pressure, it will close fairly quickly, securing the nematode, and then the fungus will secrete enzymes which will kill and digest it, and then of course they absorb the nutrients. Remember that fungi have extracellular nutrition. And so when you think of the traps, you should think of that. One of the fungi that can do this is oyster mushrooms. It's one that they sometimes sell at grocery stores. It's an edible. And I've actually found oyster mushrooms down along the San Pedro River. And so with that, we'll conclude this discussion of the ecological roles of fungi and conclude this module.